I really need a microphone, or can you hear me well? Yeah? Microphone? Mic. Oh. Sing a song. Right, so this is really quite interesting. I'm going to tell you a few stories today, and the first one, the location that we're in and what it is perfect for where it's going to start. I'm going to try and do two things today. I'm going to try and entertain you a little bit, but I'm also going to try and leave you with a little bit of information to think about and take home when you go home. And I'm going to start with this. I want you to imagine that you are standing in a horse riding arena, facing a horse that has just thrown you up in the air, and you crash down on the hard, rough ground. And you get up and you walk forward, you kind of feel the pain in your body, and you walk towards it, and you know that it's going to happen again. That was my first horse riding experience. I was about 3 years old, and that horse was a rocking horse. After that, I stayed away from horses for a long time, but when I was about 14 years old, I decided, after watching way too many movies on television, that what I want to do in life, what I want to become, is a cowboy. And so I started taking horse riding lessons, started slowly working in stables, progressing and taking care of them. And as I matured and I grew up, I did more and more. And when I was about 20 years old, I started to train horses. And this included doing all the groundwork with them, getting them used to people, teaching them how to respond to voice commands, but also riding them for the first time. And at the time, it was known as breaking in horses. Now there's probably a slightly more politically correct way of saying that. The first two horses that I worked with were really simple and easy to work. There were no dramas with them. The third one was different. She was a beautiful quarter horse. For those of you who are familiar with horses, a quarter horse, an American type of horse, brown hair, black mane. And I spent about 2 months working with her before it was time for me to go and ride her for the first time. We walked her over into the horse riding arena, my trainer, Sonny, and myself. I walked over to the horse, scratched her neck a little bit to make her feel comfortable, grabbed hold of the saddle, and moved it so she knew that I was about to do some work over there. I lifted my foot, put it into the stirrup, and slowly I started to transfer my weight over. And I knew that usually that's when they get a little bit scared, and I expected her to run away and I'll walk off. She didn't. And so I continued to shift my weight over slowly, over the saddle. Nothing happened, into the saddle, and I was now sitting deep in the saddle, leaning forward. And I began to straighten up. And at that point, everything changed, everything. The muscles erupted. She's gone crazy, and for about a minute and a half, the horse riding arena was full of dust, with her backing up and kicking down and spinning around and me holding around. And this is what I tell people in the pub to try and impress them. That's not what happened. In reality, I held on for about 2 seconds before she sent me flying up in the air. And as I looked at myself in an sort of an out-of-body experience, you know, you get them when things go wrong, I thought this one's going to hurt. I closed my eyes and just straight into the ground, just like a bungee jumper without a cord. I think I even bounced a few times up. I jumped straight to my feet and shook the dust from my clothes, checked that all my body parts are where they're supposed to be, and looked for the horse, and she was still running around the arena. I waited for her to relax and walked over again. Again, scratched her neck, grabbed hold of the saddle, same thing, put my foot into the stirrup and slowly transferred my weight over. But this time, the second my leg went over the saddle, she panicked and sent me flying down, head straight into the ground. Jumped back up, checked that everything's okay, grabbed my head, put it back on my shoulders. Okay, I'll scrap that joke next time. And looked at the horse. And she was now standing in the middle of the arena looking at me. I started walking forward, but something was different inside me. My confidence was gone. I walked over, grabbed hold of the saddle, put my leg into the stirrup, but I couldn't jump up. The horse started to walk, and I, just like that, jumped on one leg, not able to have enough courage to jump up. Fear completely took over. I didn't know it then. Now I understand that we become afraid when we encounter events and situations that we cannot control, do not understand, or believe will cause us harm. And depending on the intensity of the situation that we are in, our amygdala, a small part of our brain, takes over. The amygdala is in charge of emotional response, but it is also in charge of our survival. And when it takes over, it will respond in one of three ways: flight, fight, or freeze. And when it takes over, in a millisecond, we change. The stomach churning, the heartbeats, everything change. And if we can, and that's usually the preferred method, we run away, survival. If we cannot, we'll stand our ground and fight. But sometimes we will freeze with the hope that the danger will pass us by without seeing us. And on that day in the horse riding arena, I froze. Get back up! I could hear Sonny, my trainer, shout. I couldn't. Get up, Gary, we don't have all day, get up! Looked at the horse, looked at the saddle, couldn't do it. Took my foot out of the stirrup and turned around. I was hoping that Sonny would look at me and say, that's fine, don't worry, we'll start again tomorrow. She didn't. She said, get up. If you don't do it now, fear will paralyze you and you will never ride a horse again. I hesitated, took a deep breath, but I knew that I had to try. Stepped forward, foot into the stirrup, and again slowly started to move my weight, knowing that I'm going to get thrown any second again. Nothing happened. Continued, leg over the saddle, nothing. Sitting in the saddle, crouched forward, my muscles tight, my teeth were clenched, and I began to straighten up. Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. She just stood there as if I've been riding her for years, couldn't care less. I clicked my tongue, guided her around the arena. Perfect. I looked at Sunny, she smiled, gave me the thumbs up, and in an instant, my confidence was back up, and I felt proud of myself. And that evening when I went home before I went home, I put the saddle away, and I went home to rest the pain in my bones. I thought about what has happened. And I realized that I learned a few important lessons. I realized that Sunny was right, that if I had hesitated, I would have never ridden a horse again. I also realized that the fear that I had in my head was much greater than reality. And actually, in this case, the fear didn't happen at all. And I realized that the small step that I took forward, that small action, minimized the fear. And I was then able to continue and move on. And in life, we constantly face those challenges. We constantly face those moments where we hesitate. And fear is such a thief of confidence. Every time we let fear take over, we become weaker. Every time we overcome fear, we become stronger. And it's really important that what we do with life, with our careers, especially in real estate, with all the challenge that you face, take a deep breath, step forward, and face those fears. Because the opposite is much worse. I wanted to become a cowboy for years, and I tried really, really hard, but it never really happened. I never did become a cowboy. In 2005, I joined the real estate industry, and finally, people started treating me like I'm a cowboy. So in my bucket list, that is ticked right now. In September 2005, I was sitting in a car outside of a small street in Mount Eden. I was about to go door knocking for the first time in my life. I have never done anything like this, and I was scared. And I was parked in a car in a street outside of the street that I was going to door knock, because the car that I was driving at the time was a 1995 Toyota Corolla. And it was rusty and it was dented. And I was afraid that if I parked it in the street that I was going to door knock, people will see what I drive and not consider me as a good real estate agent. And I remember I was sitting there in the car and I was beginning to psych myself. The whole thing of, I'm going to door knock right now. I'm going to door knock. And I was going to do it. And when we need to do some things that we don't really want, how we slowly start to pedal back. We come up with excuses why we shouldn't. And so I was doing exactly the same thing. I was going, I can do this, I'm going to door knock, and start to switch to, maybe door knocking right now is not a good time, and maybe door knocking in general is not a good idea. And I kept on going all the way to, why am I here, and why am I even in real estate? And the answer to the last question, why I'm in real estate, was easy. I got into real estate simply because my wife told me to. Usually the ladies laugh and the men nod. But I knew that I have to overcome my fear, so I took a deep breath, reached for the door, stepped outside, and went out. And I started walking. I walked to the first house. The closer I got, the stronger my heart beats. Climbed up the stairs, knocked on the door, stepped back like I was told, and I was standing there, and the only thought that went through my head was, I hope nobody's home. Waited, nobody was home. I relaxed, went over to the next house. Same thing, knocked on the door, same thoughts in my head. Suddenly the door opened. I turned around, smiled, looked at the lady who opened the door for me, gone completely blank. Couldn't remember what I was supposed to say. I just stood there and waited. And after a few seconds, I mumbled a few words, gave her my business card. She was nice enough to say, no, we're not interested in selling. I said, thank you, and walked away thinking, whoa, that was difficult. Walked over to the next house, knocked on the door, nobody there. Next house, tenant's house after that. The gates were closed, and I didn't want to get eaten by a tiger, because that's what happens. The house after that didn't like it, and I said, that's it, I've had enough, back to my car. Don't want to do it anymore, and drove home. But I was really, really disappointed with myself that I gave up so quickly. So I decided tomorrow I'll come back and I'll finish that street. And so the next day again, drove my car, parked it in that street, and again that whole psyching thing, I can do this, I'm going door knocking right now. I took a deep breath, looked outside, reached for the door, turned the ignition, drove home. But this time I was really disappointed with myself. I was actually feeling some guilt about not doing this. And so I made the decision. I promised to myself next weekend I'm driving back, coming back, and I'm door knocking the street. So week passed, weekend has arrived, same thing, drove my car, parked in the street, and now psyched myself again. I can do this. I promised myself I'm going out, I'm doing this, that's it. I'm going for it. Deep breath, reach for the door, turn the ignition, drove home. Couldn't overcome my fears. Research shows that apart from the fears that we are born in and react to, we also have conditioned fears. Conditioned fears are created when we experience unpleasant or negative things and believe that the same thing might happen again. The problem is that those fears are usually irrational because our mind plays tricks on us, making us believe that similar circumstances will lead to the same negative or unpleasant outcomes. And with door knocking, it created fear in my head. And the more I thought about it, the bigger the problem looked, and the bigger my fear grew. And the bigger my fear grew, the harder it was for me to overcome this. And this is something that I noticed with a lot of people that I trained in real estate. That fear of prospecting, the fear of rejection, so many salespeople cannot overcome this, and some actually leave the industry just for that, just because of that. And I had the same problem. In desperation that day, I went over and did the one wrong thing that I shouldn't have done. I went and had a chat with my wife. And I told her, look, I don't know what's happening, but I cannot overcome that fear. It's irrational because really nothing bad has happened to me. But I can't overcome this. And so my wife looked at me and said, don't worry, tomorrow we'll go door knocking together. Next day, drove the car, parked it in that street, no more hiding. I took a deep breath, looked at my wife this side. She smiled, asked me if I want her to come door knocking with me. I said no, reached for the door, stepped outside, and house after house after house after house I door knocked that day. I finished that street, and on that day, I overcame my fear of door knocking. And during my 14 years in real estate as a salesperson and also as a trainer, I continued to door knock. What my wife did that day was very simple but extremely effective. She provided me with support. And this is an important lesson that I learned that day about overcoming fears. That sometimes when things go wrong, support gets us through it. Because when we create fears and anxieties in our head, we cannot differentiate between what's happening in our mind and what's really out there. Research into the biology of fear says that human beings are the only ones that have the ability to develop fears and anxieties, not by being in situations, but simply by thinking about those situations. And that most of the problems and the issues that we have in our lives are because we spend too much time thinking about what might and could be. And people that have phobias, fears, and anxieties cannot overcome these alone, and that's why support is so important. When we get together, we can achieve so much more. When we help each other, we can achieve greater things. Support doesn't have to be somebody who's with us along the journey, even though that's the best thing. It can be somebody who is available for us to call when we need to, or simply somebody who every once in a while just goes and says, good job, you've done well, you're doing great. And when we get those things, when we have the support, it's easier to overcome fears. Because support does two things. The first thing that it does, it gives us companionship during the hard times. But the second thing is that it creates accountability. We now have somebody who is sharing destiny with us. And when we have support, fear becomes smaller and it is easier to overcome it. And so I would like you to think about the times that you faced incredible challenge. And think about how did you overcome this. And see if there was a specific person who helped you and supported you and was there with you. And consider when you go home tonight, picking up the phone and saying, hey, thank you. Or going over to visit them and say, hey, appreciate you being there. And remember that when things go really, really hard, you need to ask for help, ask for support, and get somebody to help you get out of it. The hole that you're in. I continued with real estate after the door knocking experience, and it took me, I would say it probably took me a good year to grow and develop a relatively good business in real estate and start to earn reasonable money. In the middle of 2007, I changed offices, and a few months later, the great financial crisis hit. And I have gone from earning, at the time I was probably earning about $10,000 a month to no income at all. And during that time, I had to face a decision, to make a decision. Do I leave real estate and find a second job or find a job to do? Or do I stick with real estate and continue despite the hardship, despite the fear of becoming a failure and the fear of no income? I decided to stay with real estate. and I kept on going. We lived, funny, my wife and myself moved into our living room, and we rented all the bedrooms in our house just so we can survive. And if you can imagine that, me, my wife, 3 or 4 other students in the house, 1 kitchen, 1 toilet, going to the office sometimes was a great relief. Pun intended. And during that period, I would go out every day. I would leave house, I would leave home early in the morning and come back in the evening with nothing. My deals would fall, my listings wouldn't sell. And I kept on going, but it was really hard. I remember how I felt really bad. I would come home and I would see how my wife would struggle to pay the bills and to organize the mortgage payments. And there were times where I just thought, I can't handle this anymore. But every day I would go out and every day I would continue. And I remember I had this badge, you know, those big buttons that people hang, put on their clothes, like the peace sign ones, those big badges. I had one of those that my wife gave me when I started selling real estate. And on that badge was a picture of Batman and 3 words: courage, determination, and skill. And I took that badge and I glued it to the dashboard in my car. And I drove around with it, and every time when things got really, really hard and I thought I cannot handle this anymore, I would look at that badge and I would say courage, determination, skill, and I would keep on going. And after about a year, things have begun to turn and I started earning income again and I was able to build a good, successful career in real estate. Those of you who were in the industry at the time would remember that a massive amount of salespeople have left the industry because it was quite hard. And I often ask myself, why do I think that I stayed in the industry when so many people left? And the 2 things that constantly come back to me are those. The first one is that I believed in myself. I believed in my ability to do it, and that if I persist long enough, I will be able to create a successful career for myself. But the second one, and that's another important lesson for me about fear, was that I, during that time, did not focus on the thoughts in my head. I didn't focus on the fears, on the what ifs and what might be, and how do I survive without income. I focused on the things that I had to do day in, day out. The small activities that had kept me going all the time. And I realized that by me focusing on the reality, not the thoughts in my head, my fears were minimized. In cognitive behavior therapy, no, the computer's not on. In cognitive behavior therapy, the psychologists teach that fear is created out of 2 things: feelings and emotions. Feelings are the sensations that we get when we feel the fear, the churning stomach, the heartbeats, the uncomfortable feeling. The emotions are the thoughts that we have in our head when we become afraid. There is nothing that any one of us can do about the feeling. That is a part of who we are, part of living. Fears, the sensations will always be there. But if we are able to change our thoughts, change the focus of our thoughts from the big, great fears, fears get minimized. I learned that in real estate. Maybe we won't play this. It's all right, don't worry. And one of that was probably the most important lesson for me that I learned about fear. That if I change the focus in my head from the emotions, from the negative thoughts, to really what's happening in front of me, to the reality of my activities, then my fears become smaller and I can then continue and work on. Over my last 47, 48 years of being alive, I have been quite good in finding trouble and facing fears and challenges. And those lessons that I learned about understanding that taking a step forward towards fear makes fear smaller. The fact that what I fear in my head, the thoughts that I have in my head are usually not the reality of what is happening. Usually what I fear will not be there. The understanding that the fears and the thoughts in my head are wrong and I should focus on reality. And the fact that when I really struggle, I need support. Those things have really helped me. Hopefully that would work. No?
What's happened to the sound?
Wrong one.
Sorry, guys.
Nope.
I don't know what's happened to the sound.
That's perfect, isn't it? Talking about fear and facing challenges. So I think we'll just leave it.
Okay.
But where I want to close things is this. Fear is a part of our lives, but nobody has ever missed on any opportunity or stopped because of fear. We get held back because of our inability to overcome our fears. Fear is a natural part of our life, and it shouldn't stop us from being and achieving. It should push us towards becoming better, stronger, more confident people. And to simply put it, if we overcome our fears, we can live our dreams. Thank you very much. Fantastic video. That's all right.
Thank you, Gary.
You're welcome.
Hello. Thank you, Gary. Nice to see you again. I really like your speech, same in the training room. I started rehearsal at 2:05. I never ever be the door knock. Yeah, I think I started tomorrow for the door knock. Yes. Never ever be the door knock. But you tell me that, cover the fear, But I have no wife.
You can have mine if you want.
All right, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.